All right. Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for coming out tonight. For several intense weeks, the world has watched as a direct military conflict has unfolded between the United States, Israel, and Iran. This is a war that has dramatically escalated from a shadow conflict into open warfare, costing by some estimates over $1 billion a day for the United States alone, and an untold price, of course, in human lives and regional stability. The conflict reached a perilous turning point with the assassination of Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, and members of his family. In his place, the Assembly of Experts has appointed his son, Mojtaba Khamenei, signaling a desire for continuity and control in Tehran, even as it confirms a dynastic succession the late supreme leader had publicly disavowed. Now we find ourselves at a critical crossroads. In Washington, President Trump sends mixed signals, declaring the war is won while vowing to finish the job, all under the shadow of looming midterm elections. In Tehran, a new untested supreme leader remains in hiding, fearing he is the next target, while his government publicly demands reparations and guarantees against future attacks. And across the region, we've seen tit-for-tat strikes on critical infrastructure from oil refineries in Haifa to desalination plants in Bahrain, widening the theater of conflict. So, how did we get here? What are the strategies, legal boundaries, and war aims of each side in this ongoing fight? And most importantly, what comes next? Is there a path to de-escalation, or are we witnessing the dawn of a permanently altered and far more dangerous Middle East? Tonight, we're fortunate to have three distinguished experts to help us unpack these urgent questions. Behind me on the screen and facing you is Ray Takei, a senior fellow for Middle East Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations and a former senior advisor on Iran in the Obama administration. Ray brings a deep policy-oriented understanding of both Washington's decision-making and the internal power structures of the Iranian regime. To my left is Dr. Sahar Razavi, and she is the director of the Iranian and Middle East Studies Center at Cal State University, Sacramento, where she's also an associate professor. She provides an essential academic perspective on Iran's internal political dynamics and motivations of its leadership and how this conflict is perceived from inside the country. And to my far left is Alan Weiner, and he's a senior lecturer at Stanford's Law School and a former lawyer in the State Department's Office of the Legal Advisor. And he'll guide us through the complex and critical questions of international law raised by this war, both the legality of the war itself and the legality of how it is being fought. So we'll frame our conversation tonight in three parts: the path to this war, the realities of the ongoing conflict, and the potential scenarios for the day after. And for that, I'm going to turn to our screen, to Ray, and ask, from a Washington policy perspective, how did we arrive at this moment? President Trump walked away from the JCPOA in his first term, and what were the key decisions, calculations, or perhaps miscalculations in this administration that closed the door on diplomacy and led us down the path to direct military conflict?
Well, President Trump left the Iran deal, I believe it was in 2018. Joe Biden administration, or the Biden-Harris administration, had 4 years to come back to the agreement. They chose not to. So the JCPOA was an unusual arms control agreement because at the end it had no heritage. Those who negotiated did not want to own it, and those who opposed it wanted to tear it up. And that's essentially where we were during the first Trump administration, first Biden administration. And the second, you began to see the acceleration of the Iranian nuclear activities and some degree of negotiations between the United States and Iran. Those negotiations were rather compressed in timeline, and I should say the Iranians were trying to be creative in those talks. But ultimately, in June of last year, the Israelis decided to take matters in their own hands and strike Iran. Initially, the Trump administration was disinclined to participate in those particular attacks. If you think about or look at Marco Rubio's first statement after the Israeli attack in June, he said that the United States is not involved, and American citizens should be left unmolested. He didn't say anything about Israelis. Once the Israeli military success began to be experienced, then President Trump decided to join in and claim some of the glory, if you would. I think the June war made the March war almost inevitable because it is now the Israeli and American approach that they will attack Iran's when there is no nuclear urgency. Because the theory of the case is that should Iran build up its defense fortifications, conventional defense fortifications, missile batteries, air defenses, then behind that lurks the potential sprint to a nuclear weapon. So the way you deal with the proliferation issue is you deal with the conventional military approach. And the Israelis always understood that they would have to revisit these pastures over and over again. This is what they call mowing the lawn. I'm not quite sure if the president understood that, and he certainly didn't tell the American people about it. And there was no real discussion about it. But this is where we are at this point. After the June war, which was the most consequential event, arms control or counter-proliferation in Iran will now rely on kinetic action, which is another way of saying military intervention, as opposed to diplomatic mediation.
So that's an understanding of how we got there from the American-Israeli perspective. And as you say, there was really no preparation. The president certainly didn't seem to mention it during his State of the Union address just prior to the assertive actions, the aggressive actions. But let's take a look at it from the Tehran perspective. And Sahar, you've noted that foreign attacks historically strengthen elite cohesion in Iran. And so how did the internal political dynamics during the regime of Ali Khamenei work to, how were they perceiving this? What were they looking at an attack as an inevitability, the same way that the Israelis felt that it was going to be an ongoing effort to sort of mow the lawn, as Ray pointed out?
I think so, and I think it actually began roughly 20 years ago. I think the inevitability of another attack after the June war is absolutely expected, and I think the Iranian leadership also saw that as expected. It was quite a long buildup as far as Tehran was concerned, because once the United States invaded Iraq, and the way that that invasion was conducted and the way that Iran and the United States and the neighbors all interacted, that showed the Iranian leadership that they were going to eventually be next. So they've been preparing for it, which is why they've fortified their ammunition batteries and their weapons systems and their defenses to be able to withstand a war of attrition that could enable them to survive by outliving the United States' political will to engage in a prolonged military confrontation with Iran. Having said that, I also think, getting more specifically to your question, Ali Khamenei, though as the supreme leader, he did represent what we know as the hardline or the conservative faction of Iranian politics, which is dominated by hardliner, what we call here hardliners and reformists. Not an exact reflection, but a close approximation. Although he did represent the hardline faction, he was not the most hardline element in the Iranian political class. There were more sort of assertive approaches with respect to the United States that were advocated for, and Ali Khamenei had said, that's not in our interest right now, and we will, for example, he set a limit of 2,000 kilometers for Iran's ballistic missiles, because he saw that more in their long-term interest so as not to provoke a greater sense of urgency in the United States and Israel to attack. He also, now, of course, I'm not saying that this reflected their actual policy in practice, but he did issue a religious declaration, a fatwa, saying that a nuclear bomb was not in accordance with Sharia law, and therefore Iran was pursuing enrichment, but it wasn't for the purposes of a nuclear weapon. Again, I'm not saying they followed that policy, but the fact that he felt the need to present that to the public, to the Iranian public and the international community, reflected some of the constraints that he felt they were operating within. Now that he's been assassinated, some of the hardline factions, as they have in the past, are now, in their view, validated. Now, in their view, they're saying, look, we told you it was futile to try to negotiate with the West. We told you you couldn't trust the United States. We told you X, Y, and Z. And there is a long history of foreign intervention in Iran. And so they already were coming from that position. And now with Ali Khamenei gone, and with Mojtaba Khamenei, who has very close relationships with the IRGC and the Basij and the other paramilitary units inside and outside the country that can be marshaled. And with the way his father, mother, wife, child, other members of his family were killed, there is a real risk that the more assertive, more what you might call aggressive elements of the Iranian political leadership are going to be empowered here, which could spark a much more dangerous situation for the region and for Iran and for others, of course, because now potentially we've triggered an arms race.
Right.
And we've incentivized them now to pursue that nuclear weapon much more openly and much more aggressively, possibly.
Right. Well, we'll get to more of sort of where they are now and what the future is likely to look like and what the end game is likely to look like. But before we get there, let's sort of take Ray's argument that, in fact, the U.S. and Israel were preparing, Tehran was preparing. And so let's get the legal approach to this, which is when two states are preparing for war. And Alan, you've spoken about this war of choice distinction in international law. Legally speaking, what was the justification or the lack thereof for the initial U.S.-Israeli strikes?
Well, thank you for the question. Thank you to the Commonwealth Club World Affairs Council for inviting me to be with you. You described this as a situation that is incredibly complex, and many facets of it are quite complex. It turns out that the international legal issues are not terribly complex, at least the way that I see them. The United States is a founding party to the United Nations Charter, which establishes a prohibition on the use of force in international relations. States are not allowed to use force in international relations. There are two exceptions. One is if a state sustains an armed attack. If an armed attack occurs, there's a right of self-defense. And also if the UN Security Council, acting pursuant to its collective security powers under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter, authorizes the use of force. Force is permissible. This was done in Libya in 2011. It was done in Iraq in 1990, so this is not entirely unfamiliar. But in the absence of armed attack, if you are a black letter lawyer, if you're using the very strict language of the Charter, then there's no right to use force. Now, there is a community, and I actually number myself among them, that believe that that's a too wooden interpretation of the Charter, and that it's also permissible for states to use force if they face a threat of an imminent attack. Not a gathering threat, not a potential threat, not a future threat, but an imminent threat. In other words, the idea is that you don't have to wait until the missiles have landed in your territory before you are able to use force in self-defense. And this is referred to as the doctrine of anticipatory self-defense. I don't think any credible argument exists that Iran, at least prior to the buildup of U.S. forces in the Gulf in recent months, posed a threat of imminent attack to either Israel or the United States. When you read, as I did recently, Yair Lapid's op-ed in The Economist about finally a just war, clearly the idea is that Iran posed an inevitable threat, a gathering threat. But this is not a basis for using force in international law. So I think the use of force is quite clearly illegal as an international law matter. We can talk, if people are interested, about the status of the use of force as a domestic constitutional law matter. That's another issue. Did the president have the authority to use force without any authorization from Congress? The international law question is separate from the domestic law question. And then international law on use of force is divided into two basic categories. There's the law governing recourse to force. My wife, who's in the room, asked me why we always insist on using Latin, but we refer to this as the use ad bellum. And then there's the law governing the conduct of the war once it has begun, the use in bello. And I've talked a little bit about the use ad bellum. It seems quite clearly in my case that the United States and Israel did not face the threat of an imminent attack by Iran that would have justified the use of force. I don't think you can threaten another state. If any state actually had a right of anticipatory self-defense, presumably it was Iran in response to the buildup of U.S. arsenal in the region. But with respect to the conduct of war, the use in bello, the last few days have seen I think a very, very disturbing set of developments, which is the increasing civilianization of the war. I mean, the basic concept in the use in bello is that it's okay to hit military targets, but you're prohibited from striking civilian objects or attacking civilians. And we're seeing attacks now against fuel depots, against desalination plants, against energy infrastructure. President Trump threatened that if Iran does not surrender, he's going to destroy the entire energy system in Iran. And this is obviously deeply problematic from an international law perspective with respect to the use in bello.
Right. Thank you. And maybe if there are questions afterwards, we can return to that, whether it's the domestic question or otherwise. And I also realized that I didn't introduce myself, the guy who's sitting here talking to you. I'm Markos Kounalakis. I am a colleague of Alan's at Stanford University. I'm at the Hoover Institution, and I teach political science there. And I also happen to be California's second gentleman, married to the Lieutenant Governor, Eleni Kounalakis. So, which has nothing to do with the Iran conflict.
Thank goodness.
But I used to be a foreign correspondent. That's why I'm sitting up here. Sahar, let me come back to the points you were making, which is they were planning on a war of attrition. They knew that if this war were to come, that outlasting the United States would be a strategy. And it's designed to outlast the political will of the United States. So with Mojtaba Khamenei now as supreme leader, how does his leadership and his very real need to project strength while avoiding assassination, which seems to be a threat already and one that's been threatened by the president, change? How does that change Tehran's calculus on the ground? And is Iran truly holding the stronger hand as it claims?
This is a sensitive question and a little bit hard to answer because I would need more information than what I'm privy to be able to answer. But from what facts we can observe easily as an outsider, Iran seems to have a lot more cards up their sleeve than the United States. And because they've been preparing for this for a long time, they also have some maneuvers left that I think make the United States and Israel very nervous. What we're seeing right now with these reciprocal attacks, for example, the oil depots in Tehran were blown up, and then Iran struck the oil refinery in Haifa, Israel. The water desalination plant in Qeshm Island was attacked, 30 villages now without water. They hit a water desalination plant in Bahrain. Now the South Pars gas field was attacked, which actually is extremely problematic, much more than just the toll on civilian infrastructure, although that's grave enough as it is, because that's shared with Qatar, which is a US ally. So that attack also it was reciprocated with an attack on the largest liquefied natural gas processing facility in the world, in Ras Laffan. So what we're seeing is Iran is projecting out its power to an extent that I think we would have probably already seen contradictory statements from President Trump, but it kind of creates this impression that the United States is on its back foot. He gave 48 hours to first, actually before the 48 hours, he said, okay, Scott Bessent issued a statement saying, we are going to use Iran's oil against them. This was the framing, right, for public consumption. We're going to use Iran's oil against them by unsanctioning their oil for 30 days, so as to keep the global price of oil down. This was widely interpreted to be basically a management decision because the political fallout was difficult for the Trump administration to justify. So Iran, in response, said, that's cool, but we don't have any oil to sell. Now, the next move was, in all caps, on Truth Social, statements from Donald Trump saying, you have 48 hours to open the Strait of Hormuz, or we're going to attack your power plants. Mm-hmm. Some international legal observers very rightly pointed out that these are war crimes if that were to happen, and Iran then promised retaliatory attacks against energy infrastructure all across the region. So now, just as I was driving in to this panel, I saw that Donald Trump has made a statement saying that we are in negotiations with a top Iranian leader, but I can't say who it is, because if I do, Israel will assassinate him.
Mm-hmm. Right.
I want us to take a moment. I know this. You asked me about Mujtaba. This is answering the question. I promise. Yes. I'm getting there. I want us to take a moment to interpret this statement for how remarkable it is. Mm-hmm. Because if it's true, essentially he's admitting that we can't get our own ally to not assassinate someone we are in negotiations with, to end a hot war. That is quite a statement for allegedly the undisputed global hegemon militarily. If it's not true, to me, it would be very telling that Donald Trump would see it as advantageous to present himself as too weak to control Israel, rather than admitting that there are no negotiations, because then he would have to say, we're standing down from our promise to attack within 48 hours for no good reason, because we're scared of the retaliation. Mm-hmm. So either way, the United States is looking on its back foot, which brings us to Mujtaba. For many decades, the United States' ability to project its power, its soft power, is in large part predicated on its hard power. And its hard power, its military power, in many ways is built on an assumption by different forces around the world that there is no use in challenging the United States, because you will be obliterated. This kind of an interaction is weakening that image around the world. And it is, in my view, taking us down, again, a very dangerous path, because there are many opportunistic actors that could, way outside of Iran, that could take advantage of that vulnerability. And that could, again, really trigger a lot of downstream effects. A top Trump advisor said a couple of days ago that Israel could use a nuclear weapon on Iran. There are others who are warning that we could have an arms race where now Iran and then Saudi Arabia and then all the other states in the region will pursue nuclear weapons. So I think Mujtaba's sort of long game is allowing this to play out so that the United States' image of being the global hegemon continues to be weakened, because again, that will cause so much more damage to the United States in the long run than anything Iran is able to do with direct strikes.
Okay. Ray, before I get to you, Sahar brought up a number of legal questions that I think we need to address, because you talked about the attacks on civilian infrastructure, whether it's desal plants, the threat to go after power plants, obviously the oil infrastructure, assassination is on the table, it has occurred. These are all important international legal issues that you likely dealt with when you were in the State Department, at least theoretically, if not directly. How should we look at it from a legal perspective today, Alan?
So thanks for the question. I just want to do a quick two-finger. I'm deeply concerned about the counterproliferation implications of this. If you look at, Libya was fooling around with the nuclear program. Libya was attacked. Gaddafi was killed. Iraq was attacked. Iran has been attacked. What's the one country that hasn't been attacked? North Korea, right? Because they actually completed the sprint and developed a nuclear weapon and have now, I think, created a much more substantial deterrent. So that is one of the deep concerns that I have about the longer term implications of this. Iran and other states will say, I have to acquire a nuclear weapon. That is the only card that I can play against the Americans. On these international legal issues, I think it's interesting, also there was denial that we were involved in the attack on the gas field in Pars, that was also the Israelis. The Americans are not interested in that. I think attacking the natural environment or items that are indispensable for the survival of the population clearly is prohibited under international law. I will say the energy grid is tricky. Power systems are tricky. Those actually can be considered to be military targets. If you look at the U.S. law of the Department of Defense Law of War manual, which I have, you'll see a discussion of energy infrastructure as potentially being a permissible target. I think, again, it depends a little bit on why you're attacking it, whether you think it's actually being used to support military operations. A statement by the president that if you don't surrender within 48 hours, we're going to destroy all of your energy infrastructure clearly goes well beyond any plausible suggestion that we're attacking energy infrastructure that is tied to military operations. And then on the assassination question, again, this is also a little complicated. It turns out that the supreme leader in Iran serves as the commander-in-chief of the armed services. And so under those circumstances is considered to be a lawful target. But Larijani, the killing of Larijani, others, I mean, these are quite clearly targeted killings. These are assassinations against persons who, though they are in government, are not military figures, are civilian figures, and have immunity from attack under the law of armed conflict.
Great. Well, thank you. So, Ray, President Trump has given conflicting signals, claiming victory while continuing his attacks. What do you believe are the actual U.S. war aims at this point? And is there a coherent strategy for an exit, or is Washington reacting day to day, driven more by domestic political concerns like the upcoming midterms and the president's popularity? And a final question I'd like to ask: who is that secret person that the United States is? I suspect that if there is such a person, he may be someone who used to live in San Francisco, the former foreign minister Javad Zarif, but who knows?
In terms of the objectives, I'm not entirely sure. The president has had a number of objectives, some of them quite practical, such as degrading Iran's military capability. Others fantastical, like he should pick the next supreme leader. And notion of unconditional surrender, which nobody knows what it means. So the president has offered an evolving range of explanations, which is one reason why there is such confusion, and one reason there is degree of ambivalence about this war in the United States and elsewhere. That's been the problem of strategic communication with this administration. That's been a problem in terms of planning. So there's a lot of things that are remiss. I suspect the United States military itself does have a target list, and they're going after those target lists. And the last thing that the United States Navy will do is the convoys, because first they want to essentially degrade all the capabilities that Iran has, and then destroy the Navy. That's when you put your destroyers and others in. But even then, patrolling the Gulf is going to be hazardous. So the confusion stems from the fact that the president has a very unusual style in terms of communicating. I suspect at the end of the day, the president this is just my guess, really emboldened by Venezuela and the success that he had with some measure of impunity and lack of casualties. And he assumed a similar thing could be replicated in Iran. The fact that Iran and Venezuela are two different countries with two different political systems, evolutions. I'm not going to go into the differences between the two countries because it should be obvious. But I suspect that's what guided him. And also the success of the June War. The 12-day war in June was successful. The United States and Israel achieved their primary objectives, which is essentially destroying large chunks of the Iranian nuclear infrastructure and apparatus. So a combination of all these things probably pushed the president into this conflict. And he assumed probably that it would be achieved, successfully achieved with alacrity, but that's a little more complicated today.
So I'd like to just follow up, and I'd like to look at the day after and sort of the exit ramps and the long-term consequences. So let's talk about, Ray, exit strategies and what those might look like. You know, there's this conversation of a potential back-channel deal of negotiations that may or may not be occurring, and what would a deal that is palatable to the administration look like? And you've already mentioned that the president has his unique style and that it's hard to sort of guess at what that might be. But from a broader sort of policy American perspective, what might that look like? And how do, if at all, our European allies play into any future solution, whether it be the straits themselves and passage or some other form of engagement in the post-conflict moment?
Well, honestly, the president can declare victory at any time he wants, and he can discuss that in a way he does. And he does have a story to tell. He essentially can make a quantitative argument about how much damage Iran has suffered in terms of its conventional military capabilities. There's even a remnants of a nuclear program and decapitation of a large number of its leadership, military and otherwise, in scientific community. He can make a case about how he has successfully set Iran back as a threat to the region and as a threat to even its own public. The story is going to be complicated if the United States and the international community do not have a convincing response to the fact that Iran, with rather primitive technology, can interfere in maritime traffic through the Gulf, which is an important strategic waterway and international obligation. So that would be more difficult because what the Iranian government has demonstrated, even with the imbalance of power, even with the disparity of power between itself and its two primary antagonists, Israel and the United States, it can still inflict cost on the global economy. And it can still essentially stop traffic. Again, most of the Iranian missile attacks don't work, but they have affected the psychology of the markets. The insurance prices go up, and many ships don't want to cross that threshold. That essentially what the president has not told the American people, has not communicated thus far, is that the passage through the Gulf for the foreseeable future will require concentration of significant American naval assets. At the time when those naval assets are stretched, given the concerns about the Pacific and the China competition and so forth. So this is something, as I said, the lack of communication by him has been detrimental to his own case. But he does have a case to make.
So he could walk away and say, we won, and he has that credible case, as you say, to make. Let's move back to Tehran and how then, in this circumstance, what things look like. We see, I think you're arguing as well, and have argued in the past, that this type of an outcome will only embolden and strengthen the harder line structure and really solidify the structure as it is. How does that then future combination of leadership with a new supreme leader, the ICRG still in relative strong position with having a monopoly on weapons and industry, with a population that really is unarmed and unable to sort of confront in any revolutionary way this power that's willing to use violence against its own people. How does that structure then look, and how are they likely to continue on? Of course, it'll depend on what agreement is reached, but if, let's say he just walks away, what does it look like, both regionally, but also within Iran itself?
The biggest risk, if the United States decides to just declare victory and walk away, is that Iran will also declare victory and walk away. And just as Donald Trump has a case to make that the United States won, Iran has a case as well to make to their public and to the region that they've won. And if that's the case, what's going to happen is the deeper entrenchment of the regime, and the supreme leader, the IRGC, all of the armed forces, they're going to say, and they are going to make this case to their axis of resistance, quote unquote. They'll say, look, we faced down the world's undisputed military hegemon and the only nuclear armed country in the region, and we survived. For Iran, survival is winning. That's especially the case because Donald Trump, in one of his many, as you mentioned, conflicting statements, said that he would only accept unconditional and complete surrender, and he has claimed many times that he's totally obliterated Iran. It's unclear how successful that obliteration is when the United States and its allies continue sustaining attacks, but that only undermines this case. So if both sides are making this case, I think what we're going to see is that entrenchment of the political leadership in Iran is going to lead to much more immiseration for the people of Iran. It's going to lead to a more intense securitization of society. They will use the government will use this as the pretext it needs, just as it did after the June War, and just as it's done after basically every wave of protest for the last 17-ish years. It will use this as the pretext that it needs to even contract civil society more than it already had. It will use this to suspend what due process does exist in Iran, enact mass deportations, intensify executions, which are already at a pace higher than just about everybody everywhere in the world, persecution of journalists and dissidents. These are things that if both sides declare victory and walk away, Iranians are going to be in a much worse situation than they are right now. You will have a political class that is not only emboldened, but also wounded. And they are going to need to assert themselves even more than they had before. Any progress that potentially had been made in the late December to January protests at potentially weakening the government, as Women Life Freedom did in 2022 and 23, I believe this war wiped away that progress. If there was any progress made, which I'm not saying there really was, but it's, just as after Women Life Freedom, we did see some changes, some concessions, even de facto, on the part of the Iranian government. Those protests in January could have also led to that, but now they will not.
Can I make this one point? This is one of the paradoxical aspects of this war. At any time that it ends, whether it's this week or next month or a month after that, all three powers, all three protagonists actually have a narrative of success. The Israelis do, the Americans do, and the Iranians do, particularly if their measure of success is survival, which is actually a rather low bar, but it's more than survival. They have proven that they can impose costs on the international community. So no matter when this ends, the consequences that were mentioned are already ensured.
Right. And just to do an extension also of what you were saying, it would seem that one of the likelihoods is that there would be a race towards a nuclear weapon in a survival mentality, to just say, look, we don't want this to happen again. And the sooner we get there, the more secure we'll be. Again, as Professor mentioned, by using the North Korea example. So let's turn to the legal question, because if say the United States declares victory, I mean, and it says, okay, well, do you win a war by breaking the law? And it's this question of, looking beyond the conflict, what the long-term systemic consequences are for the international legal order if the war ends ambiguously, as we've just heard, everybody's declaring war, success, without accountability. And so does this experience, along with the invasion of Ukraine, effectively signal to other nations that international law is optional for the powerful, and that acquiring a nuclear bomb, as North Korea did, is the only rational path to security?
Well, this is a wonderful question, and I'm glad you're asking it. We're on the quarter calendar at Stanford, and I'm scheduled to teach starting in the spring quarter on Monday, the introductory international law class that I've been teaching at Stanford for more years than a gentleman should be asked to disclose. And what I've been wondering is whether I should change it to a history class, because we have over the past few years witnessed this phenomenon of seeing powerful countries, Russia first in 2014, but certainly with the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, the U.S. operation in Venezuela, which was equally unlawful, the attacks against the so-called drug boats, in violation of international law. And I've been having some debates with colleagues of mine who basically say, yes, but Ayatollah Ali Khamenei was a terrible person. Nicolas Maduro was a terrible person. This is true. I concede this. But what we have to ask ourselves, what I encourage my students to ask themselves, is understanding the relationship between what we might see as being in our transactional or our short-term interest. Today, it might be good if we take out Iran's nuclear weapons capabilities. Today, it might be good if we remove an authoritarian leader from power in Venezuela. But what that does signal, if we and other powerful countries pursue our short-term interests whenever we decide to do so, is that this systemic interest that we have in international security and international stability has been subjected to a secondary role. The kind of regime that the United States, that Donald Trump seems to want to live in, where if it's the old Melian dialogue world where the powerful states do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. This was the legal regime, in effect, that prevailed, in the international system for 2 centuries before World War II. If we paraphrase the old Prussian, political theorist Clausewitz, war was the continuation of politics by other means. Now, that approach to pursuing your interest, your short-term transactional interest, through the use of force, resulted in a system for 2 centuries of increasing interstate violence, and with evolving technologies, with the level of just extensive destruction that we experienced during the first half of the 20th century. So the idea that we should not resolve our disputes, our disagreements in international relations through force, this was not, I always want to emphasize, this was not an idea that was imposed upon the United States. International law, was not brought down, from the mountain and imposed upon us. We were the architects of the rules in the UN Charter that basically said we believe it is in our overall systemic interest to have less force in the system rather than more. The great late international law professor Thomas Frank once said that the UN Charter presented a choice between peace and justice. And yes, there might be circumstances in which we might think that the use of force could produce results that are just. But having seen what 2 centuries of pervasive interstate war produced, we made a choice in 1945 in favor of peace rather than using force to advance the cause of justice. So that's a long and maybe sanctimonious way of saying I am deeply, deeply concerned about what the behavior by the United States, by Israel, and by Russia will signal for the viability of the international system and whether we can just expect increasing levels of interstate violence of the kind that we witnessed for 2 centuries.
Wow. Okay. Well, that's a really great way of summarizing. And if you were thinking about taking the class at Stanford, this is it in summary. So, look, we've got a great panel of experts on this. So I think I'd like to widen it since we've looked at how we got here, what's going on, and what's likely to follow. If we can maybe look at the regional effects of what it is. There are a number of other countries that have now been attacked and have responded in kind. There are alliances that are being tested, both Iranian relationships. I think not even 1 month before the attack on February 28th, I think on January 29th, a 20-year strategic agreement was signed between Russia, China, and Iran, saying that they were going to have this wonderful strategic relationship. So there are these dynamics that are geopolitical, both regional and geopolitical, right? So first, maybe if we start with the GCC region and maybe Israel and take a look at how you see that. Maybe we'll start with Ray on this one, and then we'll move along and get your reflections on this. And remember, you have questions on in your cards. If you have questions, fill out your cards, and they'll be brought up here, and we'll make sure we can address them afterwards.
Honestly, in terms of the GCC, there's a lot of discussion that Iran's use of force against them will provoke enduring antagonism toward Iran. I'm not quite sure if that's the case. I think the GCC countries are going to go back after this war to where they were before the war, namely trying to figure out how they can do their balancing act of accommodating Iran, accommodating the United States, and so on and so forth. This war has demonstrated that Israel is not a regional power. It can essentially project force anywhere in the Middle East, and it does so with some degree of impunity. And I think one thing that's missing about this discussion, perhaps, is that prior to the June war, Iran did attack Israel when Israel was involved in Lebanon. From some Israeli perspective, this is not a question of international law. This is a question of the fact that the two countries were at war, Iran and Israel. And therefore, Israelis do believe that the response was quite legitimate in terms of what they would perceive to be an unprovoked missile barrage coming their way because they attacked an Iranian proxy in Hezbollah. But the region at this point is in a flux, but I do think the Arab states will go back to where they were. And everybody now has to deal with the reality of Israeli power. And the uncertain aspect of it is in the American power and how the United States will decide to stay or leave the region or what condition and what format. But the president needs to understand that the United States and Israel now have jointly the doctrine of mowing the lawns. They have both accepted the fact that the path to disarmament in Iran is likely to be kinetic action. And they have both accepted the fact that the challenge that Iran presents is a nuclear issue, but that nuclear issue could only be dealt with if Iran's conventional military capabilities are systematically degraded. So the interval between the June war led to March war, and the interval between March war and the next war is going to be determined by how degraded Iranian capabilities are and how quickly they can be rebuilt. That's a military assessment. And when Israelis decide that once again they have to mow the lawns, they will try to do so. The question then will be whether the United States will go along the third time. And what the Iranian strategy of imposing costs on the American economy and the global economy is doing is not just preventing the current war, ending the current war, but preventing the next one. So even if the United States steps back, I suspect the Israeli-Iranian fight will go on in some form, in some fashion.
Thank you. Thanks, Ray. Any thoughts on the Russia component? We have reports that Russia is collaborating with Iran and targeting American bases and other aspects of this coalition, of the Israeli-U.S. coalition against Iran. China seems to be sitting by the sidelines. Any sort of perspectives on sort of the larger geopolitical questions and issues?
Well, and we also saw, of course, the temporary suspension of sanctions on Russian oil on tankers at sea, which again, in a time when the Europeans are trying to persuade the Americans to increase economic costs on Russia for its invasion of Ukraine, the net result of this is actually to provide a little bit of a windfall for the Russians. So it's consistent. It would have been difficult for any observer of the American political scene, whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, to imagine an American leader who seemed more sympathetic to the Russian case with respect to the Russia-Ukraine war than with respect to the Ukrainian case. And so this is, I think, along with a return to a Clausewitzian world where war is the continuation of politics by other means, we really have the reiteration of this kind of highly personalist approach to leadership. Right? We have no King's protest scheduled in my neighborhood. I don't know if it's going to be in San Francisco this coming weekend. It's a return to an era of kings where kings are the instantiation of their states.
Yeah, and I think we also should probably address the elephant in the room here, which is, I don't want to go out of my lane. We have an international legal scholar here, but Israel's conduct in Gaza for the last 2.5 years has strained a lot of relationships, and it has suspended a lot of diplomatic agreements. If we look at that in the context of this longer kind of timeline of great powers butting heads and their allies also, then I think we can start to explain a little bit of the rationale behind what these different U.S. allies and quote-unquote axis of resistance parties are doing. As far as Russia and China go, China on Valentine's Day issued a statement saying that any attack on any of China's allies, in the context it was understood to be Iran, will be understood as and treated as a direct attack on China. The reason for this is that Iran's #1 export of oil was to China, and China's top two sources of oil to fuel their GDP growth were Venezuela and Iran up until recently. So they have always been very hesitant to get involved in any kind of a direct military conflict with the United States, but that doesn't mean that they're not involved in other ways. China and Russia are both supplying vital intelligence and surveillance to the Iranians to be able to shoot these missiles. And Russia has been supplying military equipment and supplies to Iran. Iran was just seen in satellite images building bunkers, not for people, but for Su-35 fighter jets from Russia. And I think we can expect that to continue, which, going to Dr. Weiner's comment from earlier, has very serious arms race kind of security dilemma implications for the world. And I think we're going to see that not only across the region, but in all the relationships. We may see a little bit of a realignment. I could be wrong. Of course, Dr. Takei also, his comment about the GCC basically going back to the way it was before is also extremely plausible. But I think we could see also some shifts that we weren't expecting as different players in the region reevaluate their security interests.
And if I might, just one other regional implication. This is admittedly highly speculative, and I'm an international lawyer, not a security strategist, but I hang out with security strategists at Stanford. And, the rapprochement between the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, and Israel is a classic manifestation of balance of power realpolitik. These were not countries who had maybe so much that brought them together, but they faced a common threat, they faced a common enemy in Iran. If Iran is substantially weakened as a result of this conflict, if I'm a Gulf state or if I'm Saudi Arabia and I look around and I think, wait a minute, who's now the most terrifying actor in the neighborhood? It's Israel. And I wonder whether a consequence of this will be to slow down any kind of rapprochement between the Gulf states and Israel, who now might see themselves as being potentially threatened.
Right. Well, so a lot of movement potentially here and realignment, as you say. So we'll have to watch this closely. I'm going to jump to the questions from the audience. One that seemed to come up just recently when the governor suggested that there may be credible threats on California is a question from the audience that says, what is there to prevent the IRG from future terrorist attacks in the U.S. or U.S. targets overseas? So the question of terrorism, which was one of the justifications for the war by the president as well, how do we see that in diminished militarily Iran, but nonetheless aggrieved? Let's start with Ray, if you would.
Terrorism has always been a problem in terms of the Iranian government's approach. I tend to be more sanguine about the possibility of direct Iranian terrorism on the American homeland. However, you may see cases, as we have seen, with a heightened degree of attack on Jewish centers and so on, and sort of a radicalization that is happening at home. That precedes this war, and it has to go back to the Gaza war as well. But the sort of radicalization climate may have a security implication. I don't know if the Iranian government, as functional as it is at this point, will like to have a terrorist attack on the American homeland, because no American president can not retaliate massively against such a thing. And I'm not sure that's the fight the government of Iran wants at this point.
Anybody else on that question on terrorism?
I mean, I think when we've seen the Iranians engage in extraterritorial terrorist attacks, and as Ray says, this is not unknown to them, for precisely, I think, the reason that Ray describes, the effort to kind of minimize accountability. It has typically been done through proxy forces. We think about the bombing of the Jewish Community Center in Buenos Aires many years ago, attacks in the Balkans. This has been orchestrated by, these attacks have been carried out by Hezbollah, which is itself, on its heels right now. So I'm not really sure that it's in a position to be projecting force. I do think, we forget, we're international relations and international law scholars, and we think about strategic considerations. I mean, I do think that we sometimes underestimate the role of emotion in this. And there is no doubt in my mind that the supreme leader, who, again, lost, as you said, his wife, his child, his parents, close family in an attack, we don't know how badly wounded he is himself. The desire for revenge, I think, will be acute. We saw, an assassination attempt of a former American president, President Bush, by the Iraqis after the first Gulf War. I would anticipate that we could see such things, not today, not tomorrow, but in the longer range. Just as the Israelis don't forget terrorist attacks, my guess is the Iranians won't forget these events either.
Right. Sobering. I have another question here, and this is, I think, to Sahar and to Ray. Is there any chance that this change will give rise to a more tolerant government, as so many Iranians have protested for?
I think it's very unlikely. I think when we look at the history of Iran, the consequences of foreign attacks. In fact, one of the reasons that clerical leadership was able to consolidate power in the face of quite a lot of rivalry from other factions post-1979 is because of the Iran-Iraq war. Had Iraq not invaded, it's very possible, it's very plausible that the clerics would not have been able to consolidate power. And in fact, much of my early research was on exactly that process. I don't see a clear path forward to any kind of glasnost and perestroika moment after this for Iran, at least not at this point.
Yeah. Ray, any sort of?
I would agree with it. The government that's going to be born, the third Islamic Republic under the third supreme leader, is likely to be more radicalized, perhaps more brittle. And certainly, should Mustafa Khamenei survived, I think it's fair to say he has some grudges against the United States. So he'd be on the cranky side of the political spectrum.
Okay. Anyone willing to talk? I have a question here about the impact on the upcoming U.S. midterms. Anybody willing to do any sort of U.S. Analysis and handicapping on the upcoming November elections and how they might, how the populace here in the United States will react to the president's actions?
Yeah, I could take a crack at it.
Yeah.
My sense is that it depends on what the Democrats do. This could very well lead to the implosion of Trump's base. That doesn't mean it's likely. We know that a majority of his base does support this war, but there is also a not insignificant minority of the MAGA base that does not support this war and are generally more isolationist in their approach. And also, they voted for him because he promised no more forever wars and entanglements in the Middle East. So he is very nervous about the possibility of the GOP not doing well in the midterm elections, and therefore some clearer path to a third impeachment proceeding, possibly this time worse, maybe conviction, maybe removal, maybe even he may be worried about prison after. We don't know exactly what's in his head, obviously, right? But if this war goes on, what we're seeing is that Trump has incentives to walk away. And Iran right now is really disincentivized to walk away because right now they, as far as they're concerned, they have the upper hand. The price of oil has skyrocketed. They are sitting on about 2,500 ships in the Strait of Hormuz that they're charging a $2 million passage fee to get out. They're saying they're going to charge quite a bit of money for people. And as oil has shot up, they're going to be able to make a decent amount of money on that as well. So right now, their incentive is to stay in it and make it impossible for the United States to ever do it again. And what that means is that they have more incentive to prolong this than Donald Trump does. And as that pressure continues to kind of layer onto him, I think we could see either more erratic behavior or less easily justified to his base kind of behavior. It's unknown. I don't want to speculate too far after that, but
Sure.
there are, I wouldn't be surprised if we saw quite a few surprises.
Right. Okay. Can we quote you on that? Yeah. Okay. Anyone else willing to take a shot at American politics there? I know this is an Iran panel. Okay, we'll stick with you, Sahar. All right, so we've talked about America. Anybody willing to take a shot at one of the other questioners' question here, which is, how's it playing out in Israel politically? What is the effect there? Ray, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I'm not sure about Israeli politics. Honestly, I haven't figured that out or paid much attention to it. I think Prime Minister Netanyahu remains a controversial figure within Israel for a variety of reasons, personal finance, personal corruption, and all that. But he is very popular on this particular issue. Prime Minister Netanyahu said that after October summit, all the rules of the game are different now, and he has proven that. The Israelis have proven that. At least at tactical dexterity, the accomplishments have been nothing less than remarkable. Now, all wars have consequences that are unforeseen, so we'll see. I don't know how this affects domestic Israeli politics, other than almost all politicians oppose Prime Minister Netanyahu are as aggressive on the issue of prosecuting the war against Iran as he is. So I'm not quite sure how different that will be in terms of its international approach. But Israel has a whole lot of other things to sort out, whether the religious has to serve in the military at the time when the volunteer army is stressed, and so on and so forth. And also the economic problems that they may have as a consequence of this war.
Yeah, I've been following the Israeli media debate on this pretty carefully, and I think it's fair to say there's not much debate, at least among Jewish Israelis, which of course is not the entirety of the citizens of Israel. About 20% is Palestinian or Arab citizens of Israel. All of the leading opposition political figures have rallied to support the cause. Again, Yair Lapid, who I think as many would identify as kind of the leading opposition figure in Israel, wrote this op-ed in The Economist that I'll be assigning to my students called, Finally a Just War. I think, though, the contrast here between Israel and the United States, and I'm just a humble country international lawyer, so I'm a little bit out of my depth when I'm talking about, domestic politics. But, I think for the U.S. president, he wants this war to end as quickly as possible because it's 7 months to the midterms. People don't have a terribly long memory around these kinds of things. Netanyahu wants this war to last as long as possible. He's got elections coming up later this year as well. And if the war is going on, I think he believes that will be a positive contribution to his electoral prospects. If the war ends, everybody will be reminded of all of the issues that they were unhappy about with Netanyahu prior to October of 23, after Hamas's attack against Israel. And Netanyahu has been exercising a so-called rally round the flag effort since October of 2023 to try to consolidate Israeli support by saying, look, we're fighting a war, we need to be united. It hasn't gone all that well, but I think for Netanyahu, the longer the war goes on, the better, because the alternative stories are not good.
Not least of which is that he continues to be able to postpone and delay his trial for corruption based on exigent circumstances. What is a war with Iran if not an exigent circumstance?
War in general, yes. We're down to our last couple of minutes, and of course everyone wants to know from a legal scholar why, Dr. Weiner, you said Khomeini is a terrible person, Maduro is a terrible person. Quite a few people might put Trump's name in that. What in this bizarre new reality we have would happen if another superpower were to try to remove Trump as he has removed Khomeini and Maduro? And of course, we now see that the technical means are no longer limitations to this type of an attack. And you also mentioned that in the past, an American president has been targeted. This is the crazy reality that I think you've warned us against if we are going outside of the means and understanding of this rule of consent.
This is what I try to encourage us all to ask ourselves when we're considering a short-term, when we're considering a violation of the law that we believe is in our short-term interests. I try to ask my students and others to say, what if this practice was generalized? What if our enemies did it to our friends? What if our enemies did it to us? Would we think that that rule isn't, would we want this to be the rule? Now, again, the United States has managed under this administration to avoid really facially confronting that issue, because the assumption has been, well, of course, nobody's going to fly into Pennsylvania Ave and snatch Donald Trump, put him on a helicopter and fly him back to Venezuela and put him on trial. But we do see that there are limits. There have always been historic limits to the ability of states to be hegemons and to simply achieve their objectives through force. And again, we see this even in the current war that we're describing in the Gulf. One of the things that, Ray, you mentioned that the missiles, number one, the numbers that the Iranians have fired. Actually, it's been under 1,000, probably. It's been fewer than we would have expected. The drones, though, have been actually really, really problematic and destructive. And, they cost about $35,000 to make, and we shoot each one down with a missile that costs $1 to $2 million to make. There are anxieties in the Gulf about the depletion of their Patriot and other ABM their missiles, right? So it is, I think, a mistake. It's true, you know, that we learned at Milos that the strong do what they want and the weak suffer what they must. But the Athenians lost. And I think it's important to remind ourselves about the limits of hubris.
I think that's a great way to end this evening. And a lesson for all of us to take away as we really are confronting this uncertain moment when a war is a hot war, when people are clearly suffering. Californians in particular have an awful lot of relatives and friends who are in Iran. We have the largest Iranian-American population in the country. It's a sobering moment, and one where I think we should all be reminded of the limits of power and the power of hubris. So thank you all for coming out this evening.